All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back for another awesome episode with another incredible guest. Today we have Sam Forget with us. He has graced us with his presence from across the river. He's in New York. I'm in Jersey, so Hudson River for all you geographical people. Okay, he is an expert in helping people who are burnt out dieters break that cycle of yo-yo dieting. He's been in the game for over 10 years, and I know he's going to provide a ton of value because he is also a fellow presenter virtually for the Real Coaches Summit. So you know he's a real good freaking coach if Aram approves. So welcome to the show, Sam.
My man, you just set the bar high. I hope I don't disappoint. I appreciate it.
Hey, I always bring it up here. We'll keep it there.
I'll try to fill those shoes.
Awesome. So before we get into the X's and O's of everything, like I like asking people where they started, but especially wanted to get into how you in particular were in the beginning going towards athletes, right? You're like, I want to train these high performers. I want to like be with those types of people. But then General Pop pulled you in like it does for so many of us. And I come from a very similar background. So I'm curious, what was that like differentiator? And if you want to go further back, feel free. But what was that like thing that got you to be like, all right, the athletes are cool, but General Pop are my people?
To tell you the truth, it was largely not by choice at first. To make a long, boring logistical story short, my original intention when I entered the industry was to train people out of an at-home studio that I had been outfitting to be very performance friendly. And long story short as well, my athletic background is basketball. That's how I started training people. That spilled over into football. So it just seemed like the natural progression. You're a former athlete, you have that athlete bias. And so it just so happened that that at-home studio was not technically zoned to be able to have people coming and going from the house without astronomical insurance and all of these headaches. So last minute, I had to pivot and start a traveling personal training service. So I was loading up a bunch of equipment into the trunk of my Hyundai Sonata and driving around to anybody who would have me come to their home to train them. And obviously the very nature of that is you don't have too many NFL hopefuls who are hiring traveling trainers with adjustable power blocks. So I just kind of went headfirst into Gen Pop right after that. But what I ended up finding, as you started to allude to, is that was genuinely far more enjoyable and rewarding to me just to see the light bulbs turn on and just like certain things hit, whether it's a better relationship with food or, oh my God, I thought I would never lift that weight, or I feel better than I have in 10 years, compared to just working with athletes and meatheads, which is fine. Like you and I both have a lot of friends who do that and they crush it and they love it. But I just lost interest to a large degree in, helping somebody add 2 inches to their vertical or have a more visibly defined bicep vein. I'm like, that's cool. And like, if those are things you're interested in, you do you. But the Gen Pop side of things definitely reeled me in because I liked seeing a lot of those wins that were maybe a little less conventional, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense because I know everybody listening right now is usually moms 40 plus who are on the end user side. But as a trainer, I mean, people are always like, don't you want to be like training somebody that's like in shape? And you're like, honestly, it's the total opposite because it's kind of boring training people that are really in shape. They already kind of know what they're doing. You tell them to do something, they do it perfect, pretty much on the first or second go. And you're like, all right, what next?
Yeah, and I have friends who train athletes and top physique competitors at a very high level. And this is not to rip on that. Again, there are pros and cons to any coach client dynamic, but you deal with egos. You deal with it's more like injury management at a certain point. You're dealing with very limited time frames of whether it's a 2-month off season or something like that. So a lot of stuff that you don't have to deal with when you're working with regular people like you and I who just want to look a bit better and want to feel a little bit better and not necessarily do anything extreme. So again, not to knock those kind of higher level performance or hypertrophy based goals, that stuff's fine. And I think regardless of whether or not you're trying to go to the NFL or the NBA, you can pull a lot of stuff from that and apply it to, again, just like the average lifestyle. So I think there's stuff there. But no, I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah. And it honestly, as you said that, I like that triggered like one of those old memories. You're like, damn, didn't realize I was in there. But I remember like when I was working at a gym, our boss would actually make us like pull out from these like athlete programs, these celebrity programs that you see all over Men's Health and things. And you're like, pick out the good stuff that we're doing and highlight it, because with all those people, as many shenanigans as we see going on with celebrities and athletes, they're always usually doing something right.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, not to be a contrarian here and talk about the other side of things, I think it is important to point out that a lot of celebrities, high performers, athletes, etc., are successful in spite of the things that they're
Yes.
doing and not because of the things they're doing, whether it is elite genetics, whether it's unlimited resources, whether it's being able to outsource quite a bit of stuff that the average person is not able to outsource. And again, there are things, as you just mentioned, Brian, you can pull from, like, all right, they're doing at least a handful of things well. Success doesn't happen by accident, but we certainly can't overlook some of the
Yeah.
more gimmicky stuff that people like to quote as proof or supposed proof that a method makes sense when, they probably had the right parents as well.
Exactly. And are you a Always Sunny fan?
No, well, I'm vaguely familiar with the show, but I can't say I
Okay.
would know a specific reference.
Well, for anybody listening, Rob McElhenney, who is like the Mac in Always Sunny, had a really great quote, because there was a sequence in that where he gained and lost 60 pounds as a character, and he did it in real life. And he was shredded at one point, and he got in front of all these cameras and said, like, it's really not that hard. You just got to work out twice a day, 6, 7 days a week, have your meals cooked for you, make sure to hire some good babysitters. It's not that hard. And it's like, it was making a joke, but it's like some of these people make it seem like it's not that big of a deal, but it's a commitment.
And I love that level of honesty. And obviously he's a comedian, so he's
Yeah.
delivering it very tongue in cheek. But I think the fact that it is even humorous at all speaks to the point of how, I don't want to say out of touch we are, but how easy it is to forget all of the things somebody might have going for them to get to those very top levels. And this is not me trying to discourage anybody who wants to undergo like a more meaningful transformation. By all means, go right ahead and do it, but just be aware that, and I don't want to put too much stock into the genetic basket because there's a tremendous amount. Unless you're trying to go to the NFL, NBA, top bodybuilder, etc., there's a 95% chance that your genetics are not what's holding you back. But for this specific example, whether it's genetics, whether it is the ability to hire a personal trainer 5 days a week or have a personal chef or a babysitter, I think it's very easy to look at purely the outcome of how did Rob do that? Oh my God, he looks ridiculous, and not look at all the other stuff in the middle that might be a little, and again, this is not meant to be discouraging by any means, because I think people can move the needle even more than they expect, but certainly important to consider the entire equation and what goes into it.
Exactly. And on top of that, we also got to consider the people that don't have it so easy. Like Oprah is a clear example, like has all the money in the world, can do the exact same things, but still doesn't, because weight loss isn't that simple.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's just, and I'm actually glad this is becoming more and more of a topic in our industry, where I think it was so important for so long for the calorie deficit thing to be top of mind and shout it from the rooftops. And I think there's
Yes.
still tremendous value in circling back to calorie deficit, have to burn more than you take in, because people are still well-intentioned people are still tricked by all these other things. And it's like, hey, all these diets work the same way. That said, the point you just made about Oprah in terms of you can have all these unlimited resources and still fall into certain traps, I think speaks to the point that calorie deficit, or a calorie deficit, and having, just the knowledge and awareness of that might help you weed out what not to do. But that information alone doesn't necessarily help you follow through. That's more of the behavioral, psychological side of things that needs to be addressed. So again, I think it's great at first. I think there's still tremendous value in circling back to, yes, a calorie deficit is king, but then we have to continue the conversation and not just answer everything with calorie deficit. Okay, we got it.
Yeah, it kind of just leaves you in that like blank zone where it's like, all right, I know the target, but there's no bridge to get there. Like, there are no steps to take just saying calorie deficit.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm glad that you brought up mindset, because this is the reason I love bringing on other coaches, because that's like the new shift now. Like we were very heavy, especially in the early 2000s, 2010s, is like, what's that secret magical program? And now we're starting
Oh
to
yeah.
realize that there is no magic to anything. It's how can you get somebody to do something that they don't naturally want to do? And that's where the magic is. So my question to you is, when you have somebody come to you, because you work with a lot of yo-yo dieters, where are they usually at, and what are some first steps to get them to the calorie deficit?
Phenomenal question. So one of the first things that I do that almost nobody is eager to do, and that's putting it nicely, is have people prepare to diet. And I know this is something you and I have talked about off air in the past. And even the phrase itself, not only does it sound unappealing, what do you mean prepare? Like, I want to lose the weight and I wanted to lose it yesterday, but it also sounds a little ambiguous. Okay, what does it actually mean? And I often like to use a workout analogy to describe this to people, where if your goal was to, say, deadlift as much weight as possible, could you theoretically walk into the gym, load the bar with hundreds of pounds, pick it up, and possibly do okay with that lift? Yeah. Would you undoubtedly do dramatically better if you walked into the gym 5-10 minutes on an incline treadmill, short dynamic warm up, a little bit of power work, and then 7 to 12 minutes later, after a few warm up sets, the unsexy stuff, you took that same weight? Yeah, absolutely. You'd crush it. Dieting is very similar in that a lot of people are trying to build this very tall tower on a somewhat broken foundation. And this is not me calling people broken, but if we're being honest, sometimes the habits are a little janky. So, it's very much person to person, but it could be anything from their sleep hygiene, stress management, which is another one of those things that I think a lot of people consider that to be an ambiguous focal point. Like, yeah, manage my stress, but what does it actually look like? So perhaps we can go into that in a second. But whether it's sleep, stress management, honestly, a lot of the stuff that's happening outside of the gym, because I think people put almost too much stock into what the workouts can do for them, and making sure all of that is in a really good place so that when we do turn the dieting card and things are logistically harder because we have a smaller budget to work with, you're dealing with more constraints, you're dealing with less energy, you're dealing with less fuel, all of these things, the likelihood of success is now dramatically higher. And because that solid foundation was in place, you'll have an easier transition away from dieting, which is another phase that I think a lot of people overlook. It's the, how do I reach this goal weight? How do I get my before and after? Okay, what's your exit strategy from this diet? My what? Like, we got to look at the other side of things as well. So to go back to that workout analogy, thinking about the dieting process as a whole, very similar to these workouts where we have this warm up, we get you ready to diet. We have the dieting process itself, which we can think of as the workout, which, keep in mind, workouts have rest periods. Diet should have rest periods as well. Diet breaks, maintenance phases, etc. And then you get to the tail end of the workout, diet. And then that's when we have the cool down period. That looks a little different person to person as well, whether it's a bit more of a drawn out reverse diet, whether it's just straight up to maintenance, whether it's getting somebody away from tracking as quickly as possible, depending on, any potential burnout, etc. But that's the general flow for sure.
Awesome. And I'm so glad you went into that, because everybody usually thinks, hey, I could just jump right in, right? Like, dieting's just something that I pay for and then I get right off to the races immediately. But a lot of people got to build those building blocks to actually get where they want to go. Now, when they're in the process, like, we know, I've probably covered it at length in this podcast, there's roadblocks that come up, there's things that throw people off course, but then they always come back. But let's skip ahead. I want to know, when it comes to that exit strategy, because I know people listening right now are probably like, what is that? What does that look like in a general sense of when somebody's hit their goal weight, they're feeling like $1,000,000, and then that fear sets in where it's like, oh my God, I don't want to lose this. How do they not lose it?
I think one of the bigger mistakes that people make when they enter that territory is taking their foot off the gas far too quickly, because we all, subconsciously or not, associate dieting with restriction and restraint and sacrifice and deprivation to some degree. And then we associate all other periods of life with, YOLO, like just, treat yourself and all these other things, not realizing, and actually, to backtrack a little bit, something I think people need to come to terms with if they're interested in succeeding over the long haul is the fact that life after dieting does not look that different than when you were actually dieting.
Wait,
So
can you say
yes,
that again, just louder for the people in the back?
of course, if I wasn't in a small New York apartment with thin walls, I would yell it. But I think that's something that, like, people are almost, I don't want to say doomed to fail. That sounds so negative, but the likelihood of you succeeding, even with a really well structured diet where you are kind of priming for things, you have the diet breaks, you have the maintenance phases, you have this exit strategy, but you haven't yet fully come to terms with the fact that post dieting looks, depending on the person, 80 to 90% like it did when you were actually dieting in terms of the emphasis on food quality, hunger management. I actually think meal timing is quite underrated. Perhaps that's a side tangent for us as well. Sleep
Oh, we're
hygiene,
definitely
stress
going to dive
management.
into that.
um, you know, the primary things that change, and I'm happy to walk us through what that actual exit strategy looks like step by step. But to kind of summarize, I would say the primary difference between dieting and not dieting would be the level of precision. So you might be going from MyFitnessPal and meticulously planning all of your meals in advance and using a food scale to, okay, we're just going to plan in advance, but we're going to ditch the food scale because we're going to trust that, okay, like nobody's a great eyeballer, but people can be good enough for maintenance for the most part. So we're still going to plan ahead to make sure we're in a good spot. And then eventually, maybe we phase off MyFitnessPal, et cetera. So we have these things in place as confidence builders. But when the dust settles, again, you're still looking at 3 to 4 meals per day that revolve around a protein or vegetable, lots of water, walking a lot. I know I'm being redundant going over the same things here, but that's something else that I think a lot of people lose sight of is that the recipe for success, that base model, the 80% of the equation looks completely the same for every single one of us. Like people talk about, personalized approaches. And yes, I think that's important to a large degree, but the recipe almost never changes. The quantities of each of those ingredients might, depending on what the goals are, but the recipe never changes. So I know I'm kind of beating
Yeah.
that over the head here, but I do think
Hey,
that's
please do.
something. That's something that I think not enough people come to terms with is when your diet is over, your process isn't over as well. You're just being a little less meticulous, a little less precise. That's it.
Exactly. Because to bring it back to the athletes, I mean, you see these bodybuilders, you see people that like their physique, like celebrities and things, their physique is their livelihood. If they do it consistently over and over and over again, it's usually not I eat these foods when I'm dieting and these foods when I'm not. It's I eat more or less of the exact same shit.
Yeah. And you manipulate the portions. I just had that conversation with a client who was asking great questions about, okay, like I've pretty much reached my fat loss goal. Now what? And we went over some of the things she was eating. And I'm just going to throw out arbitrary examples. This may not necessarily be it. 6 ounces of chicken, 200 grams of rice, 100 grams of black beans, and salsa mixed in a bowl or something like that. And that's her fat loss meal. Well, the maintenance meal looks like 6 to 8 ounces of chicken, maybe 200 to 300 grams of rice, 100 to 150 grams of beans, and maybe a little more salsa. And if the goal were actually to turn toward gaining muscle, guess what? You just manipulate those things a little bit more, which I know some people might look at that and be like, well, that's boring, yada, yada, yada. But getting results isn't boring. So if you felt amazing, you get to put fairly little thought into your nutrition. You eat things that keep you full, that lead to better workouts. You're seeing the physical changes. Your health is improving. It's like that's actually not boring at all. It's quite exciting to see that stuff. I just don't think
Exactly.
enough people get over the hump to see that ROI. So they eat chicken for like 3 days in a row. They quit on their diet and be like, "Well, that whole thing sucked." I'm like, "You're gonna get to the other side, and you'll stop
Yep.
seeing it as just this horrible thing that you have to suffer through."
Exactly. And there is value in repeating meals if you do enjoy them, because I think everybody's in this variety kick. Like, I need something new all the time. And those of us that have done it and been in it and kept the weight off long term, pretty much, I mean, most of the people I talk to have about the same 3, 4 options for lunch, same for breakfast, maybe 1 or 2 options. And then dinners where it's fun, dinners where you experiment. And that's okay. Like I don't understand this need for variety that is propagated all over Instagram. It's like, who can come up with the craziest dish?
Yeah, I mean, you'll see that, can I have recipe ideas? I want recipe ideas. I found this on Pinterest, and I'm like, that's fine. But I want you to be aware, and this is something my clients can tell you I harp on quite a bit. I want you to be aware there's no door number 3. So door number one is a very simple approach to your diet. No, you don't get all the novelty and whatnot, but a very simple approach to your diet where you almost look at your plates as like a template of, do I have a lean protein here? Do I have a vegetable here? Fibrous carb, etc. It's not the flashiest thing in the world, but again, you get to put very little thought into whether it's going to the grocery store, whether it's actually planning ahead. Tracking those meals is very easy. Again, the trade-off is just you don't have all the novelty. You don't have the smoke machines and the fog machines and the flashing lights. Door number two is a tremendous amount of variety. It's the whole, I get bored and I need to mix things up. That's fine. But with that comes more time at the grocery store, more time doing macronutrient Tetris, more time tracking, more math, more fatigue, in my opinion, from a cognitive perspective. What I think a lot of people are asking for is door number three. I want to put like a negligible amount of effort into planning ahead, grocery shopping, meal prepping, tracking, all this stuff. But also I get bored really easily and I want to mix things up all the time. That door number three does not exist. So we bring it back to those first two options that are actually on the table. Yeah, go through, what might be a boring diet on paper, but you get to mostly run on autopilot and get great results. Or if you're somebody who gets bored, that's fine if you want to mix things up. But be aware, there are additional cognitive and time demands that come with that. And you can't then take issue with that as well. You got to pick one of those first two doors.
Yeah, it feels like with nutrition and fitness, it's almost this fantasy land where people have this idea in their head that I don't have to put in that much work and I should be able to do it as long as it's that magical solution. When it's like, if you go into finance, for example, you can't get out of debt not giving a crap about your purchases on a monthly basis. If you're if you're trying to be really spiritual, you don't get that way by not showing up. Like, there's a million different scenarios, but you got to put in the work.
I love the financial analogies. This is another thing my clients will tell you I have 200 of. But if we think about meal variety, or the whole idea of, hey, I get bored, I want to mix things up, to the analogy you just used of, okay, what if I want to say budget to get out of debt? Picture if that was your ultimate goal, I want to be in a better financial position. But I get bored going to the same service providers and having the same subscriptions every month. So every single month, I'm going to cancel my subscriptions with these people. I'm actually going to get a totally different apartment or a totally different home, and I'm going to budget for new items every month. Granted, that's dramatically more tedious, but we get the gist here that it's like, okay, that feels a little ridiculous. That'd be unnecessarily time consuming. That's quite a bit of a trade-off just for the sake of a little novelty on a monthly basis. Never mind weekly or daily in the nutritional space. So again, if you want that, that's fine. You just can't take issue with what's then required to succeed with a lot of moving parts. And I think I can speak for, both of our client bases when additional complexity, additional time, like these are things that none of us want to do. And these are things that neither of us want to ask of our clients. It's just like, hey, I know you're already strapped for time and energy, but I need you to spend even more time on this stuff just for the sake of a little variety. It's just not worth it for most people.
Yeah, it's like we planned out all these meals that you really, really enjoy, but let's come up with like 10 more. Screw it. Why not? It took us like a few months. Let's just add on another few months to figure this out, how all these puzzle pieces fit.
I know. That's why I like the phrase or the label macronutrient Tetris, is because it gives us a really good visual of throughout the day we have these things kind of falling. Let me see how I can make this fit. But if I do that, am I going to have to change that? Like, you don't have to do that stuff on a daily basis. I would actually say, and I'm sure you've seen the same thing, Brian, that there are always outliers, but generally speaking, my clients who do the best, who have nutrition can be difficult for everybody, but who have the least difficult time with their nutrition have no more than 2, maybe 3 breakfasts and lunches that they rotate between from now until infinity. And when they do make an adjustment, it's usually a subtle one. So it might be, okay, every morning I have protein oatmeal that is just like plain oats, almond milk, protein powder, and a banana on top. Okay, after a few weeks, I'm getting a little bored of that. I wish I could look forward to something else. Instead of doing a chocolate peanut butter, protein powder, and a banana, now I'm going to do a vanilla protein powder and add berries. So the foundation, like the skeleton, the template doesn't really change. So that's the upside, right? You don't have to put a tremendous amount of thought into it. But we add another bell, we add another whistle, just so we kind of feel like things are a little bit different.
Yeah, and I love that because it gets into the concept. It's not, I wouldn't put this into variety. It's more like an evolution of your meals. And
Well
let's
said.
say you're a beginner and you're really struggling to get yourself to a place where you feel full and you're in a calorie deficit at the same time. You could take that exact same approach. It's not for changing tastes or anything like that, but how about we find a way to put fiber in there? So instead of the bagel that's white bread, we go to a whole grain one, but they're about the same calories. That's evolution right there. And then instead of, I don't know, instead of whatever you normally put on it, swap it for a protein in there, like a leaner meat that you could toss in there instead of loading it up with butter or something like that. There's ways to upgrade and improve, and those same skills transfer over.
Yeah, I like that word upgrade specifically. And I think you explained that perfectly. Where to go back to expectation setting at the beginning of what will eventually be a dieting phase, I do think a lot of people anticipate. And to tell you the truth, this isn't really people's fault. This is decades of diet culture insisting this has to be the case. This is not so great coaches in our industry still giving people bodybuilder diets from the 90s. So the expectation of most people is, okay, I signed up with Sam or I signed up with Brian. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to have to do egg whites, Ezekiel bread, rice cakes, and air for breakfast. And it's like, no, let's just look at what you're currently doing. And maybe it's, we can give 1,000 examples here, but let's say it's that breakfast sandwich where it is a bagel with eggs. Maybe currently it's a shit ton of cheese on it and you have no fruits, no vegetables. The first subtle adjustment, the upgrade, again, to steal your word, which I love, could be instead of just eggs, let's do it maybe 2 eggs and 2 egg whites, calories down, protein up. Instead of an ungodly amount of cheese, let's do a slightly less ungodly amount of cheese. I have a feeling you're not going to notice a dramatic difference. Maybe we even put a little bit of like some greens on top. You don't really taste it when it's a warm sandwich like that. You can kind of sneak it in. And then as a side, let's have an apple or a banana so you're not starving by 10 a.m. And right there, the foundation of the meal is still mostly the same. And it's not, I think another hurdle for a lot of people is it almost feels like they're not doing enough. It's like, okay, I'm dieting. I associate it with having to do X, Y, and Z, to which, I always go back to, okay, you're sitting here telling me that you feel like you should be doing more, whether that's in the form of eating less or being more restrictive with your diet. But how has that worked for you for the last, in many cases with the clients that we work with, 10, 15, 20, 30 plus years? It's never worked out for you. So perhaps we leave a little in the tank. And this is not to say there won't be sacrifices. I think the industry as a whole has almost yo-yoed so far away from admitting to people that, hey, there's going to be a level of restraint here. You're going to be hungry at times, etc. But we also don't have to creep that far away from sustainable. So essentially finding that sweet spot.
Yeah. And I love how you brought that up, that a lot of clients will get to that place where they're like, I'm not doing enough. Like, I feel like I'm not putting in enough effort for this to work, when it's almost, it's weird because this is how I frame it for my clients, is that we want to get to that place where it's like, I feel like I'm not doing enough because that means it's easy. That means that you have more to give. And that's how you want to operate. You want to have that reserve tank ready to go at all times.
Yeah. I always say you should, your plan should be constructed with the least motivated, least energetic, most burnt out, screw it version of you in mind. That's who we're creating the plan for, because 60 to 80% of the time, arbitrary numbers, but we get the idea.
Yeah.
That's the person that's going to be following this plan. Because, for anybody listening to this who is, working with me or working with Brian or hiring another coach, you're hiring them when you're at your most motivated. Like when you submit that application, it's enough is enough. I'm going to do something. I'm going to lose fat. And I love that. And I absolutely love that motivation. But I like how you mentioned, Brian, leaving a little something in reserve, because, and there's an expression I like here, burnout is a result of borrowing tomorrow's energy in advance. So if we look at it in the health and fitness space, that's often where a lot of sustainability, consistency, motivation issues come from. We are borrowing a month's worth of dedication and discipline in that first 10 days of dieting, where I know you said to eat 1,700 calories, Brian, but that felt like a lot. So I've been doing 1,400 just to play it safe. And I know you said carbs are fine, but I just feel like I'm somebody who loses weight a little bit better without carbs. I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You are borrowing week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5. Like, you will have nothing in reserve. And yes, you'll move the needle right away. You get that little dopamine hit. But if we're talking about something that's actually going to work for the long haul, I would much rather have you finish every week feeling like could have done a little bit more. Good, prove it. String together months of this at 80% consistency. And ironically enough, you'll be in a far better place than if you put your foot on the gas, crash and burn, have to start from the top again over and over. And people do this for decades. It's like, hey, maybe we switch something up here.
Yep. It's almost like that pushing yourself to that point where you have nothing left isn't exactly a great strategy.
Yeah, almost.
Maybe.
I mean, to go back to the workout side of things, over the last, I would say 10 months or so, I have gotten the best results that I've ever gotten from my workouts with the least amount of volume. And for anybody who's listening who's unfamiliar with that term, think of it as just roughly the amount of shit that you're doing in the gym. That's the general idea.
Yep.
And so much of that has come down to the fact that if I know I have 2 to 3 top end work sets on 4 to 5 exercises, for example, my level of intensity and focus and effort on those sets, because I almost feel like I'm not doing enough, is sky high. And I finish every week with a little left in the tank, eager to get back to the gym for the next time, compared to looking down at my lower body workout for the day. And it's squats, front squats, hack squat, leg press, walking lunge, reverse lunge, leg curl, leg extension. I'd look at that and already not even want to try. I'm just like, maybe I do that the first week I hire Brian when I'm super excited to get after it, but it's just, it's not going to happen long term. So ironically enough, turning that dial back down almost to the point where you feel like, we keep saying it, where you feel like you're not doing enough. Good. Prove it to us. String together 3 to 4 weeks and then earn the right to more complexity, to more intensity. And 95% of the time, you won't even have to turn up that dial because you finally put together 2 months at 80% consistency and you feel like a different person.
There was a lot of good stuff. My mind was going like, we could go here, we could go there. But honestly, I think we're really doing a good job of portraying that it's not about how much you can do. It's about what the right amount for you is. And I know workouts are a great example because I know personally, I struggle with adding more volume because you feel it immediately and your body's like, no, we were good before. We were good. Go back. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things where you got to see where you're at and see what your body's going to give you, because I know when it comes to workouts, it's not how much work you can put in, it's how much work you can put in and recover from, because that's what creates the adaptation. You can't get it without the recovery. And
absolutely,
I wanted to go into this because I saw a while back you transitioned back to writing your clients' fitness programs. Are you still doing that? And why the change back? Because I know a lot of people are niching down and being like, nutrition only, just nutrition.
Yeah, so great question. Couple things that come to mind. Number one is that, and perhaps this context is important, the whole reason I've been niched down after, at that point, it would have been 9 or 10 years, to nutrition and lifestyle coaching specifically. So everything outside of the workouts is because the vast majority of people who hire me have a fat loss goal. And it's pretty much everything that happens outside of the gym that dictates whether or not you lose. Actually, I want to correct that. This might sound pedantic. Weight loss specifically. We'll talk the difference between weight loss, fat loss in a second. But people come to me, they want to lose weight. That largely comes down to your nutrition, your sleep, your stress management, all this other not very sexy stuff that we've been talking about. So it's really just doubling down on the things that are the biggest needle movers for most people. It's, I had a lot of people coming to me who are getting after it to a degree in the gym, at least in waves. And it's like, all right, it's all the other stuff in between that we need to focus on. So that was the initial catalyst. But over time, and perhaps I should have seen this coming, I thought about it pretty much initially after I made the change. There's a quote, I wish I could remember who I stole it from so I could give credit. But the quote is, all that other stuff outside of the gym is important, yes, but your workouts tend to be the glue that hold everything else together. And I just found that to be the case so often, where even when I wasn't actively programming for new clients, I just noticed time and time again, the people who had a very dedicated habit of working out, even 2-3 days per week, were a lot more consistent with the other stuff.
Yeah.
And the other big reason, as I started to touch upon there, is, people hire me, they submit the application, I want to lose weight. And I'm like, I get what you mean. And I'm not trying to be pedantic here, but what we're actually after is fat loss specifically. We want to maintain and ideally develop muscle, but at least maintain every ounce of muscle you have while losing body fat. That's what's going to produce the biggest aesthetic difference, the biggest change in your health, quality of life, longevity, you name it. So that's actually the top priority. Muscle retention is priority number one while dieting. I cannot stress that enough. Yes, the sustainability side of things, which is a bigger picture conversation. So much more succinctly, I would say those two things. I just found that, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, the workouts were the glue that was holding everything else together for most of my clients. I'm like, all right, let me take the reins on this a bit. And I just wanted to make sure that my clients were doing the absolute highest yield stuff when it came to their workouts, because, and this may ruffle some feathers, I still have plenty of people who they get after it consistently, but 1 week might be Orange Theory, followed by a random hit workout, followed by a core swipe workout on Instagram, followed by whatever. And yes, they worked out 4 times, but was that highest yield for their goals? Almost certainly not. So
Yeah.
maybe it's a little bit of a control freak thing. I don't know. But
no, I mean, at the end of the day, if we're being totally honest with people, you can lose fat that way, but it is nowhere near best practice. Like medicine has best practice, and there's like certain medications that do better than other medications. When it comes to fat loss, when it comes to exercise, strength training and prioritizing muscle building, especially, and like strengthening everything is the way to go. And those HIIT boot camp style things are a really good way to burn you out, to have a negative hormonal response, and to just get you subpar results at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, I actually, not to shamelessly plug here, I just put out an
plug
email.
Away.
But I just put out an email for my list about what I consider to be the enjoyability versus optimal spectrum. And let me just say, these things are not as mutually exclusive as I might make them sound here. But for simplicity's sake, most people who come to us, they consider a tremendous amount of variety to be really fun. So that structure I just described of like, I like to mix things up. I just want to break a sweat. I don't really want to go too heavy, etc. So the enjoyable side of the spectrum could be berries one day, Orange Theory the next day, Peloton the next day, going on a run and doing an Instagram swipe workout. And that, I cannot celebrate and commend that enough for getting you moving, getting your heart rate up, building endurance, developing social connections, relieving stress, tremendous upside. But if we're looking at, and this goes back to the door number 3 thing, if we're looking at what most people say they want in a coaching application or, check-ins with us, et cetera, and hey, I really want to get stronger, I want to see very big visual differences, we got to get off that side of the spectrum a little bit, embrace a little bit of suck, and move toward what is technically the optimal side of the spectrum, which should be a lot less variety, progressive overload, very well selected exercises, lengthier rest periods than you're probably comfortable with, just milking a program for all it's worth for 6 to 8 to 10 plus weeks. If it's producing a result, we don't just arbitrarily change things because of a date on the calendar. And I want to go back to what I just said. These things are not always mutually exclusive. I do have clients who consider what I just described as the optimal side of the spectrum highly enjoyable, and that's great. But I'm speaking to the majority here that tend to be somewhere in the middle of those two of like, all right, well, I like to mix things up and I just want to break a sweat and I want to stay moving, but also I want the results associated with the other side of the spectrum. So this is where all of us have to decide where we want to land on that spectrum. Am I comfortable giving up a little bit of what's technically optimal because this is the style of workout I like? And if so, that's great. Again, all the power to you. I'm not here to talk you out of it, but I am here to make it very clear this is exactly what you can expect results-wise from this approach. And if you're telling me you want more, we got to move you along this spectrum a little bit. Hopefully I explained that okay, because it was a visual thing in the email.
Perfectly said, because I'm a very firm believer that many things that we create dichotomies around are really just spectrums. It's not like all or nothing for a lot of things. And for nutrition, for fitness, it's usually somewhere in the middle. And you just got to figure out what your middle is. For some people, like I know clients right now, they'll work out my workouts twice a week and then they'll go to Pilates, or they'll do my workouts and then go to a boot camp with all their friends. And it's like, if that makes it enjoyable, if that means that you're going to keep doing this for years because it's a community aspect, you're enjoying it and you're reaping the rewards, that's your best case scenario. And that's your optimal.
Perfectly said. I mean, I won't even I won't try to add anything to that and take away from what you said, because I think you described it perfectly. What I will do is draw the parallel here to the nutritional side of things that we were just talking about, where you have this very high level of nutritional intensity that you might feel like is optimal, but you're far better off operating at, say, 80% intense or optimal, and then just doing that for weeks on end.
Full circle. Would you look at that?
Full circle, right? And then actually, it's almost like you saw the email, because that's what you described in terms of a weekly workout setup is the case for 90% of my clients. I have, say 5% of people who are like, if I leave results on the table because I do all this random shit, that's fine. I'm like, cool, you do you. And then I have people where if I programmed 3 sets of 10 of banging your forehead against a wall, but it was optimal, just like, sure, I'll do that. But for everybody else in the middle, I do like that structure quite a bit, where it's, say, perhaps 2 to 3, maybe 4 meat and potato, high yield, big bang for your buck, very much in line with your physical and health-based goals workouts, and then 1 to 2, maybe 3, depending on frequency, volume, all this other stuff, more fun-based workouts like you described. I'm going to do Pilates, I'm going to do a long hike, I'm going to do this. And, I don't think people need to agonize over getting all the way to what is technically optimal for physique development and strength development. Because talk about full circle again, going back to the NFL, NBA, IFBB pro bodybuilders, unless that's your end goal, get off that side of things a little bit, operate at 80%, and then just run that into the ground.
Yeah.
And you may find, one last caveat,
go for it.
Different seasons of life, you might move a little bit back and forth on that spectrum. I have clients who during a fat loss phase, they want to turn up the dial a little bit on the workout side of things to really ensure that they don't lose muscle and they see big visual changes. And then when they're hanging out at maintenance and at lower risk of losing muscle, they move back toward the novelty, enjoyability side of things. If let me mix things up a little more, maybe drop down to, 2 full body workouts, or maybe like a lower upper full split or something like that.
Yeah. It gets into the topic that I think Dan John probably does like the best at explaining. You're familiar with him, right? I feel like any trainer worth their salt knows who Dan John is, but he does the seasons of lifting, and it's like that first third of the year is that fat loss time, because everybody's dialed in, everybody wants to get ready for summer, and then summertime's like maintenance, get outside a little bit, don't spend as many days in the gym, but hold on to what you got. And then wintertime is like hibernation season. That's the time to hit PRs, to go crazy, to crank up the volume, and that could be another way that you go about it too, where it's like, all right, what season are we in and what makes sense for my life right now?
Definitely. And I keep saying to go back to the nutritional conversation. Nutritional conversation, I started to touch upon the idea of diet breaks and maintenance phases, which are like rest periods.
Let's go into that. Because diet breaks, from dieting, I don't think people hear enough about them. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, so for anybody who's unfamiliar, they're essentially the same thing. When you hear people talk about diet breaks and maintenance phases, it's largely a time difference. So you'll hear people talk about taking like a 2 to 3 week diet break. Whereas when you say maintenance phase, with very few exceptions, people are talking about at least a month, if not 2 to 3, even 4, 5, 6 months, depending on how long you've been dieting. And if that sounds utterly terrifying to you, and it would be an immediate no if me or Brian suggested this, that's a very good sign that you're likely somebody who is very much due for a diet break or maintenance phase. I will say that in the short term, the physiological upside is largely overblown. So obviously, when you enter a calorie deficit, there is a level of metabolic adaptation. There's nothing to panic over. It doesn't mean you're broken. It's normal. And I think once upon a time, people would frame diet breaks as these things that would skyrocket your metabolism and get it revving again so you could go to diet. And, the research seems pretty clear at this point that the upside in the short term is largely psychological. It's okay, I've been dieting fairly hard for, I'm going to make this up, 12 weeks. So now for at least the next 2 to 3, I mean, when in doubt, erring on the side of more time with your feet out of the dieting door is a great idea. But yeah, let's say, you have a 12-week dieting phase, you come out of it for 3 weeks. Again, you will see some physiological stuff, right? Higher energy levels, better gym performances, better recovery, etc. But it's not this big dramatic thing. That requires far more time spent out of a dieting phase. But the psychological upside, while it certainly doesn't apply to everybody, and some people just like to get it done, let me get in and get out, I think is not something to overlook in terms of now maybe during a diet break, you can work in a muffin and not feel like just blew your calories for the entire day, or your workouts for that period of time are a lot more fun because you get a better pump and you don't feel beat to shit when you have a bar in your back. So
Yep.
that's the general idea for diet break versus maintenance phase. And again, timing wise, the more time you spend not in a deficit, the more responsive your body will be while you're in a deficit, especially if you approach that maintenance phase the right way. Focus on, boosting your metabolism is such a buzzword phrase that I just think it's bastardized. But the general idea
I use
would
it
be,
sarcastically, and I think people like think I'm serious. And I'm like,
yeah,
no.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there isn't as much that there's so many directions I could come at this with. That's why I'm getting tongue tied. I think, 80% of the time when you hear boost your metabolism, it's attached to some nonsense. So the no nonsense version in terms of what you can actually do, developing muscle to some degree, although that is often dramatically overblown. You're looking at a fairly marginal difference in terms of calories burned at rest with a pound of muscle versus a pound of fat. Certainly sleep. I keep saying sleep hygiene and stress management. Those are either progress amplifiers or progress stunters. Getting as many steps as you can get on a daily basis, training hard, recovering hard, all this stuff to, again, lay the foundation for re-entering a dieting phase. And then I also think the other thing to consider psychologically with a much longer term period of time away from dieting is that you can almost lift a lot of that burnout where you're constantly doing macro math, trying to see what fits. And sometimes you just want to eat the muffin or the cookie and not think about it as much. And I mean, a lot of the women that we both work with and just clients in general have gone 30 years without being able to just eat a muffin, without doing calorie math or carb math or something. So you have to question, like, what is the value of having a season of life where you were not agonizing over it? And if you're kicking and screaming at the idea of that and dragging your feet, how's your current approach working for you? And I say that not to sound like an ass, but like, I don't want to see you keep falling into the same cycles over and over and over again, when I'd say most people are due for a pretty lengthy period of time away from dieting.
Yeah. And I think what scares most people is the fact that a lot of people have not mastered the art of maintaining their weight, because we live in an age where 20 pounds off, 40 pounds back.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you help people combat that? Because that's probably like, I remember when I listened to Jason Phillips, my current mentor, for the first time, he's like, we don't have a weight loss problem. We have a weight maintenance problem, because everybody's lost a crap ton of weight at some point in their life, usually. And then it always comes back. So how do you like to set people up so that doesn't happen?
So this largely goes back to that priming period that I talked about at the beginning, where we're ideally laying a really strong foundation.
Coming full circle, right back to the beginning.
Yeah, that's just our thing, apparently. Laying that really strong foundation. So that's kind of the more logistical side of things. Psychologically, coming to terms with the fact that the diet is not the thing that you do to get ready for a high school reunion and then you throw it to the side when it's over. It's like, this is a fundamental lifestyle shift that you're going to have to make. But in terms of more tangible, actionable strategies here, I'm a big fan of what's called approach-based goals compared to avoidance-based goals. So most people who want to lose weight and then eventually keep it off, if you ask them how they're going about that, I'm eliminating this, I'm cutting out that, I'm avoiding this, I'm trying to not do that, I'm trying to stop doing this. And can that theoretically work? Yeah. But I don't know about you. I don't wake up in the morning excited about all the things that I get to eliminate from my life.
I'm so glad you're going down this road.
Yeah. I'm not saying there's no utility to that. Like, oh, I need to eat fewer heavily processed foods. Yes, that's a no-brainer strategy. But if you can have more of an approach-based focus, what can I add to my day-to-day? What can I add to my life? Whether that's more high quality sleep hours, whether that's more unplugged time, whether that is, more steps on a daily basis, more direct sunlight, more pounds on the bar. How can I add more muscle? How do I have more fruits, vegetables, water, all this stuff? That's a lot more fun to wake up to in the morning. So when you consider the sustainability component, yes, both avoidance-based and approach-based goals can theoretically produce the same net outcome. But from a psychological side of things, which one are you more likely to stick with over the long haul? Waking up and thinking about all the shit that you're supposed to, quote unquote, supposed to stop doing or eliminate or avoid, or if you wake up and think about all the things you get to add to your life. So that's something that immediately comes to mind is a fundamental shift that people can make in the way they think that turns dieting and health and fitness into something that is actually empowering and enjoyable and not this thing that they have to suffer through to get ready for the reunion or the vacation or whatever the case is.
I'm just sitting back like, yes, amen. Preach on, brother.
Can I throw one thing in here
Yes.
on top of that I think makes a big difference? Yeah. I find that when people have a very hard time maintaining their weight, among many other reasons, a lot of it comes down to they're only making food decisions based off one of two things. When they are dieting, it is purely, can I make this fit within my calories? It is numerically driven without a whole lot of regard for how it impacts their satiety, their digestion, their energy levels, their workouts, their sleep, their recovery, etc. And then when they are not dieting, it is purely what tastes good in this moment. Okay, I'm no longer, quote unquote, on my diet. Pizza tastes good. I'm going to have that, again, without a whole lot of regard for that other side of this triangle of numerical stuff aside, fleeting pleasures aside. How do you actually feel an hour after you have this thing? How do you anticipate feeling tomorrow morning? And when people don't make enough decisions with those as their audits, with those as their North Star, again, I don't want to say you're doomed to yo-yo diet, but the most likely outcome is I'm really good when I'm tracking and when I'm on MyFitnessPal, but every time I stop tracking, I gain all the weight back. Well, there's a good chance you're not making enough this might sound gimmicky, but like feeling focused decisions of, okay, scrap the taste that you're going to have for the next 2 seconds and then forget about a week, or not even a week later, an hour later, forget whether or not it fits in your calories. How are you going to feel when this meal is over an hour from now, before you go to bed and tomorrow morning? And if your goal is, I want to make, it doesn't have to be all the time, but for the most part, I want to make decisions that allow me to say, I'm going to feel damn good in each one of those hypothetical scenarios. Maintenance will be far less of an issue, and nutrition will just be more enjoyable.
100%. And I love that we brought up the hunger awareness part of this, because that's where it gets into the whole, you can have what you love on these diets, but you just can't have as much of it as you want. And you got to know the consequences. I don't know about you, but I went through a phase with bodybuilding where I would have Sour Patch Kids, and it took a big chunk out of the calories. And I'm like, oh my God, I am ravenous right now. That's the trade-off that you got to consciously make, because I think it does take a lot of people by surprise, where it's like, but my coach said I could eat whatever I want and lose weight as long as I stick to these calories.
Yeah, I've been beating on this drum for a little while now. The idea of, I'll show you how to lose weight without giving up your favorite foods. And similar to the calorie deficit thing, I still think that is an important message that a lot of people need to hear. Because if you took 100 people off the street and said, how do you lose weight? 97 of them are going to say, I can no longer eat my favorite foods. So again, I still think it's an important message, but it's only half a message, because it's ... But those favorite foods have to be consumed far less frequently in much smaller amounts, and you can never go back to having them the way you were before. And I liken this whole thing to, I never want a client to sign up with me thinking they're about to do a 5K only to find out they have a marathon ahead of them. So I want people to have crystal clear expectations that, yes, you can absolutely eat your favorite foods and still lose weight. But, to go back to the financial example, let's say you have a calorie range of 1,550 to 1,700 per day. And you decide, I want to have 2 pieces of pizza and a glass of wine because my coach said I could have my favorite things and still lose weight. If I'm being generous, we're looking at 250, 150 there. So what is that? 650.
Yeah.
You just used over 1/3 of your calories on something that is not only not going to make you feel good beyond the initial satisfaction, it's not going to keep you full for very long. So then you're left over with fewer than 1,000 calories, depending on how you crunch those numbers. And that's supposed to get you through the rest of the day. That's supposed to, get you through your workouts. And this isn't me saying you should never have 2 pieces of pizza and a glass of wine, because again, we're not necessarily trying to be optimal all the time. But I do think the notion of like losing weight without giving up the foods you love and all those things tend to be unintentionally misleading, let's call it. Because again, I just think there's a second half to that sentence where, it's not a full truth. And it is like, hey, do you want to do a race with me? And you're like, okay, it's probably 5K. And then I'm like, by the way, I didn't mention it's going to be a marathon and you're going to run for the next 4 hours. It's like, okay. And that's discouraging. That's deflating. And I don't want that for people.
100%. And as you were calculating the calories, I was doing it in my head. I'm like, yeah, because me and Sam and all the other good coaches actually feed our clients. It's not 1,200 calories across the board, because it sounded like you were basing that off of like a 1,800, 2,000-ish calories, which...
Yeah. I think I said 1,550 to 1,700, which is a fairly commonish range.
Yes,
for a lot of my clients.
That. Guys, if you are on anything like around 1,000, 1,200 calories because you went to like some weight loss clinic with a quack doctor, don't do that. Because if you want to do this the right way, you need calories. And it speaks to people's ability to really succeed if they find the right approach. Because I don't know about you, but you could hold a gun to my head and I will not do a 1,200 calorie diet for months on end. Some people have willpower of gods and they've just been pushed in the wrong direction. So everybody listening right now, if you've done that and you've lost weight on like 1,000, 1,200 calories for months and months and months, you have that effort. You just need to hop on the right horse.
Yeah, it's just like redirecting. And that's the thing. I never want people listening to this to feel bad about all the times they've cut out carbs or tried to eat 800 calories, because I admire and applaud the level of intensity in which you are willing to approach this. What we're obviously trying to do, Brian, is just redirect that effort to something that isn't a ticking time bomb. Like the cliche, the candle that burns twice as bright burns half as long. We just don't want you to run into that over and over again. And what's funny about the average 1,200 calorie diet is that it's only a 1,200 calorie diet on paper. Because when people say, oh, I'm eating 1,200 calories and I'm not losing weight, that's because if we look at the actual numerical breakdown, Monday, 1150, and I'll summarize this, Tuesday to Friday, somewhere between 12 to 1350, maybe 1,400.
And keeping in mind that most people are over by 200 to 400 calories on average.
Oh, yeah, I'm being super generous here, right? So that's what's logged in MyFitnessPal, right? So we're already, call it 11 to 1,400 from Monday to Friday, but your calorie budget was already so low that you were eating, again, like rice cakes with a sprinkle of cinnamon as your treat. And elite bodybuilders, the time and place for any strategy, but for the average person, that is a ticking time bomb. And then people, of course, on the weekends, the second they feel like they're going over their calories, what is pretty much everybody do? They stop tracking their food. And 99% of people wildly underestimate how quickly calories can add up, even when you're not like eating a full pizza. Like just the average meal out in the US, we're looking at about 1,200 calories. Most apps on most menus now are like a mini meal in themselves. Even if you split that, you might get another 300 there, more if it's like loaded nachos. If you get a drink or a dessert, that could be another 200 to 500 calories. So with a pretty standard night out, that might be 2,000, 2,500 plus calories. And again, I'm being a little bit generous here. So if you had what we consider to be like normal or even like middle ground kind of splurgy meals beforehand, you can end up with 3,700 calories for the day without doing anything drastic. So you might be sitting here saying like, no, like, I was sticking to 1,200 calories like pretty much all the time. That may be true. But what also may be true is the times you weren't, you brought your net average right back up to your maintenance calories of, 1,900. So ironically enough, increasing your on paper calories can reduce the net calories consumed, because now when you enter the week with, let's say, 1,550 to 1,700, the amount that you feel like you're not quite doing enough, you're not dieting as hard as you need to, you'll be able to work in, let's say, a single serving bag of chips that's 150 calories, or a glass of wine on a Wednesday night, just so you don't accidentally turn that into a weekend food and create all this buildup. And then by the weekends, things don't feel as scarce. It doesn't feel like, well, I can't have any of this goes back to the favorite things conversation. And because things feel less scarce, now when you have kind of a small dose of them, it doesn't feel like, quick, I got to get it all in while I can before I go back to this 1,200 calorie parameter. So now, even though on paper, your goal is, I'm going to summarize again here, simplify and just say 1,700 calories per day. And you're like, well, why would I lose more weight eating more calories? I'm like, because the net result is actually you eating fewer calories. You just don't realize it. And I do think, as a bit of a side tangent, that can be a little misleading when people post side by sides of like, oh, this woman, 1,200 calories, she was plateaued. And then in this photo, she lost a bunch of weight and put on muscle, whatnot. And it's like, oh, 1,700 calories. It's because her metabolism skyrocketed. I'm like, no, she just wasn't doing the famine, then feast thing over and over.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, the net takeaway there being, if you're really struggling, erring on the side of a smaller deficit, ironically enough, will almost certainly produce faster results.
Yep. And to pull the curtains back a little bit, this is exactly why calorie cycling works, why intermittent fasting works. Because if you, at the end of the day, put all those calories down on paper and say, this is what I got for the week, every diet that puts you in a calorie deficit on average is going to work. Regardless if it's a detox, a juice cleanse, like that's pretty much what they all do. It's a matter of which one you can do the longest.
Definitely. And I'm speaking of doing it the longest, to quickly go back to the diet break and maintenance phase side of things, just because I think a lot of people then wonder, well, how often do I take that and when does it make sense to? And again, this just to add to the whole, well, how do I do this for the longest? How do I make this at least somewhat sustainable? Because sustainable dieting is a myth in itself.
Ooh,
that is, again, a rabbit hole that we so that is a complete myth, and we can circle back to that in a second. Yes. But real quick on the diet breaks and maintenance phases, how often do I take those? It's very similar to when you're in the gym and you're warming up on a bench press and your shoulder feels a little funny. You do the smart thing and you don't add more weight to the bar. You listen to your body, and it's like, when in doubt, err on the side of giving your body the breather. It's the same thing with dieting. So if you're 8 weeks in, you're 10 weeks in, and I'm not saying to pull the plug when you're absolutely crushing it, but when things are starting to waver, don't wait until you're totally burnt out, crash and burn, wicked rebounds or anything like that. Stay ahead of it. Turn that dimmer back. I guess it would be not down, up. Turn the dimmer back down. Actually, give yourself a little bit more flexibility. You get that breather.
Man, a perfect
I dropped a bomb there. Apparently, I love analogies. But yeah, I know I dropped a little bomb there saying sustainable dieting doesn't exist, because that is also a hot topic in our industry.
Absolutely. And I think that would be a good one to end on before I ask the last question. So just curious, what exactly did you mean by that for everybody who like their ears perked up like, wait, what?
Yeah. And they think I'm either being a contrarian or just full of shit or whatever. I'm happy to explain. So your diet, the noun, the things you eat on a daily basis, that should be overwhelmingly sustainable, where you're not doing, people do like the Special K diet or the grapefruit diet or the prepackaged meals diet, and like all these things, like that's your diet, the noun. That we want to be mostly sustainable, where you look down at what's on your plate on a daily basis for the most part and say, yeah, I could see myself eating like this for a very long period of time. Again, seasons of life, things change, but generally, dieting, the verb, which is what most people, knowingly or not, are talking about when they are mentioning sustainable dieting, is inherently a myth. Because from a physiological perspective, you can't possibly stay in a deficit forever or you would wither away and die. So and that sounds ridiculous, but we have to keep that in mind. Yeah. So the very nature of dieting, the verb, is a myth. On top of that, when we look at highest yield dieting strategies for not everybody, but most people, things like fairly meticulously planning your meals in advance, going to bed somewhat hungry. I'm not saying starving yourself, but embracing a level of hunger, getting things on a food scale, eating something different than your partner or family, which these are all the unsexy things that come after the, I'll show you how to lose weight without giving up the foods you love, ... It's all these things that I'm mentioning now. Those things are extremely high yield for not dragging out your diet and living in this weight loss purgatory where you're dieting on paper, but you're not getting diet specific results. And that absolutely crushes people. But those things aren't meant to be done forever for the vast majority of us. So if we run everything through that audit of like, well, could I see myself doing this forever? You're going to eliminate a lot of things that are going to make your diet a lot more painless. And again, keep in mind, we aren't trying to pull that slingshot so far back away from what's sustainable that we end up ricocheting the other way at the tail end of the diet. But you are going to have to get away from that middle ground a little bit and creep into that what is technically unsustainable to some degree territory. I don't know if you're a basketball guy at all, but do you know Steve Nash by any chance?
I used to watch his tapes when I was playing when I was younger.
Perfect.
I had those DVDs.
Perfect.
Man.
So, So for anybody who's unfamiliar, Steve Nash is a Hall of Fame point guard,
the great Canadian hope,
and Yep. Well said. Great reference. But he had a Hall of Fame speech. And I know this seems random, but bear with me. He had a Hall of Fame speech, I guess, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago now. And he directed a portion of that speech to his kids at the end. And one of the messages that I really liked is he said, "Hey guys, I'm paraphrasing, but like, balance comes later." And if you look at everything that Steve achieved, he would not have done. Nobody gets to the NBA by having like this balance. Like they don't achieve all, and he's a ridiculous athlete and businessman and coach and all these other things. Like there are seasons of life where you were purposefully, I guess, imbalanced for lack of a better word. And that stuff comes later. We never want to stray too far from that so we don't risk an extreme rebound. But to go back to the main point here, sustainable dieting, the verb to diet, physiologically impossible. And then if we look at the tactical side of things, high yield dieting strategies aren't really meant to be sustainable. They're meant to make your diet as painless and non-drawn out as possible. Food on your plate, the noun, the things you're eating on a daily basis. Yeah, that should be overwhelmingly sustainable. Yep. Hopefully I explained that.
To piggyback on that, I know when I was at the nutritional coaching conference last year, coaching con, there was a perfect analogy, or not analogy, but a perfect way of putting this. There's a woman called Hannah Eden who is very big on Instagram, and she was up on stage and she's like, balance does not exist for most people who are trying to perform highly or trying to achieve a goal. It's more about finding harmony. You need to figure out how to make everything work together in a symphony, and that's where the magic happens, not when you're trying to balance everything out on the same scale.
Yeah. And there's another, not to add yet another analogy or quote here, but the idea of if you're trying to balance too many things, that's like running the first mile of a dozen different marathons. You have all the fatigue of running 12 miles, but you don't really have the satisfaction of really getting very far in any direction. So yeah, it's, temporarily not that balance, creeping into things that are, it's funny how certain words, restraint, stricter, unsustainable, have become like these dirty 4-letter words in fitness, because the industry, again, I think has, for a lot of good reasons, but has swayed very far from being totally transparent with people about what this stuff takes, which is a level of sacrifice and things that, to keep echoing this theme here, that most people would not consider to be sustainable. But if you want, a different outcome, the approach has to be different.
Yep. And if we're talking about fat loss in particular, if we do it once, that's all we need. Okay. If you do it once, exactly. You do it right, you knock it out, and then you don't have to worry about it ever again.
Yeah. I will say, and this is meant to add what you're saying, not contradict it in any way. And I'm sure you've actually seen a similar pattern.
Sam.
That yeah, this is a debate show now. I tell my clients the very same thing, like do it once, do it right. But I think in terms of realistic expectation setting, just so people don't feel like they're failing if they gain any weight back. And actually, I would venture to say that you and I probably fall into this pattern a little bit, where you do like the big main diet, you do it the right way, you lose, whether it's the 20, 30, 40 pounds, 50 plus, whatever, and you get to a place you feel comfortable. I do think that most people, whether it's every 12 to 18, maybe 24 months, benefit from and end up needing just like a spurt of dieting, because just the very, and I mention that because I don't want people to think that they failed if they go from 175 to 150 and after a year or two, they're at like 162. Like that's normal. We are fighting an enormous uphill battle, hyper processed, highly palatable foods, the social situations that pretty much all revolve around food and drinks, food environment stuff, high levels of stress, etc. So if you mostly maintain that initial bigger loss, and then periodically you just kind of tighten things up a little bit and never get too far from a spot that you feel comfortable, that to me is highly, highly successful and nothing to hang your head about. So again, I say that not to contradict you, but just to add, like, fast forward. Okay, we do the big main diet. And then after that, periodically, because maintenance, as you know, Brian, is not a set number. Okay, cool. You got back to your college weight. Well, what's required to stay to that weight at the decimal is not something, here's the sustainability thing again, is not something you're going to be willing to do forever. But if you can stay within striking distance, something you feel comfortable with, that is an enormous win that you should be very proud of.
Totally agree. Because another thing to circle back about how you said how we were talking about maintenance and making sure that we keep ourselves at a good range. This is where it's probably the most important is when you're exiting your diet and you bring the calories up to maintenance level, understanding what your fluctuation range is incredibly helpful, because there are many people listening right now, and those of you who know, you know who you are, that the second the scale goes up 1 pound, boom, back to diet.
Diet, yeah.
You
Yeah,
need
yeah.
to know your range. We do not exist in a specific weight at all times. Okay, we start the day lighter, we get heavier as the day goes on, and we continue that cycle. Sometimes we weigh in heavier in the morning because of a bigger meal, a saltier meal, or whatever. You need to understand where your maintenance range is, and then that's your playground. That's where you can like have fun in there. And if you stray a little higher, diet here and there, like a month to trim off like 5 pounds, bang, done, cut it out, back to as usual.
Exactly. And I would say also being very, I don't know if cautious is the right word, mindful about, like, don't be so trigger happy with re-entering a dieting phase. Like, to your point, Brian, most people, the second they get even mildly uncomfortable, it doesn't even have to be like visual fat gain. It's just, I was 150 when I finished the diet with Brian, and I've been weighing at 154. Like, I can't let this get away from me. And then they dive right back into that diet again, not realizing that that's the very cycle that leads to issues managing weight in the first place. So anytime you were introducing the psychological and physiological stressor that is a calorie deficit, that should be a very conscious, mindful decision of, okay, there's never a right time to diet, or a good time, I should say. But am I in a season of life where I can put 2 feet in this door and be consistent enough to not land in weight loss purgatory? For some people, at the time we're recording this right now, the holiday season, as eager as you might be to move the needle fat loss wise, if you kind of play the tape forward and say, okay, what do I have in the coming weeks? What would be required in those situations to still land in a deficit? Probably makes sense to kick the dieting can down the curb a little bit. And that does not mean we just treat life like a free-for-all between now and then. This is actually a great opportunity to focus on developing strength, developing muscle, all those approach-based goals that I talked about that further solidify that strong foundation, so that when you do make the very mindful, conscious decision to enter a deficit, we're not doing this perma dieting thing, it's as high yield and as painless as possible. A little bit of pain, right? There's some sacrifice, there's some hunger, there's some restriction, all things that people don't admit anymore. But as painless, relatively speaking, as possible.
Yes. And I like how you brought up those other goals too, because that helps people stay consistent for the long term. But everybody listening, if you are gaining muscle, you're going to have to gain weight. So just know that's coming. It can help having measurements, especially hip waist area, just to know that, hey, I'm not putting on fat, I'm putting on muscle.
Yeah, that's a great tip. And the other thing that I think is really valuable for people who have a fairly emotional relationship with the scale, and it's kind of a trigger to get back into dieting, is actually breaking out pen and paper and thinking about the question, okay, I say I want to, I feel best when I'm at 150. Like, oh, that's just where I feel good. I'm like, okay, let's pretend for a second that's true. I want you to write down how you feel like your life would be meaningful different, say 6 pounds away from where you are right now, or even 20 pounds, just this 150 number. What do you associate with that? So, oh, my clothes fit better, and I look a little more toned in the mirror, and I'm not as bloated, and my energy levels are high, this, that, the other. And what you'll find is that most of the things you list are available to you at a variety of body weights that were not what you weighed in college before you had 2 kids and a social life and a career and all of these other things. So then when you see that, you can go, okay, I'm hell bent right now for whatever reason on losing the last 5. Perhaps if I stepped away from dieting for a second, focused on those approach-based goals, I might actually check all the boxes on that list without weighing some arbitrary number. So I do think that can be a really powerful tool for I think the scale is a phenomenal tool. I'm a big fan of it for most people when used properly, but for the sake of not having emotional attachments with it, again, give a little bit of thought to what you associate with the lower number. Ask yourself, you might you might already be experiencing the things that you associate with a lower number, but you're overlooking it because your metric of success is hitting that lower number. So getting very clear on, okay, if this, then what? And then look for that stuff.
Exactly. Because a number is just a number. What is it really getting us? Well,
Big time.
I have a million more ways I'd want to go. Like, I really think this conversation could be like a Joe Rogan, like 3-hour, 4-hour long ordeal. But to spare all the listeners from having to listen to us any longer, I have one last question, because I'm really liking the direction this has been going lately. It's you answer the question from the previous guest, and then you leave a question for the next guest. All right. Okay. So before we get your answer, what's your question for the next guest?
Is it fitness specific, or is it any question?
Anything.
Okay. So when I did the first season of my podcast, I would finish with something I called the Fast Four. Actually, it was the Quick Six, which was never quick. So I made it the Fast Five, still not fast. And then I think I finished it the Fast Four. So I'm trying to think back to some of the more popular questions there.
You can leave 4. Like, I'm down to make one of them like, well, the last guy.
I won't screw the next person. No. Last guy was, overzealous. All right. This question, I really liked hearing people's responses. What is the single biggest thing that you want to accomplish personally or professionally in the next 12 months? You can go in either direction, but single biggest thing you want to accomplish personally or professionally in the next 12 months.
All right. Next biggest thing. Okay. Cool. I cannot wait for that answer, because the next guest is actually going to be recorded today. So.
Oh, beautiful.
All
beautiful.
right, cool. Now the question for you is, what are you doing today to prevent having regrets in the future?
Let me think about this for a second so I don't give a knee-jerk C- answer. I will say something I have been doing in general, and then today specifically, that has been tremendously helpful for mental health, clarity, and then urgency in my actions, which that could be a topic here in itself, is, not having that delayed life approach where it's like, I'd like to, one day I'm going to, that sort of thing. So this ties in nicely, I think, with not having regrets, is a very unstructured written brain dump throughout the day. So I do think that there's obviously a time and place for journaling prompts and reflections and this, that, the other. And it's something that I advocate for, a lot of my clients, especially before bed, to kind of, unwind a little bit so their mind stops racing, etc. But I had been carrying around like a dollar store. It's like an Amazon notebook. That's just something I can just scrap at the end of each day. And I have been, anytime I feel, it doesn't just have to be stressed or anxious. It can be happy as well. Almost just documenting. And again, it's purposefully not structured. That way there's as little friction as possible. It has to be this many minutes or this many words or anything like that. It could be, I feel incredible right now. Why is that? And then again, that might sound like a straightforward thing, but I think a lot of times people gloss over those moments. So I might be, instead of just like getting in and out of the gym and knocking it out like a to-do list item, I hung around for 20 minutes after and talked to a few of my buddies there. And that really gave me a lift in an otherwise isolated day where I'm working on my laptop. And then from there, I can go, okay, how can I structure my day in a way where there's more of that? Or the other direction, if there's, something stress and anxiety inducing, you can see themes when you're actually writing that stuff down on paper. The other thing is a lot of that negative stuff tends to repeat constantly as a subconscious thought and make you, stay stuck in fight or flight mode all day. So this is now a long-winded answer, but the succinct version is brain dumping, journaling, whatever you want to call it. But the caveat being a lack of structure. So it's very low friction, and I can just try to extrapolate stuff from the things that I'm writing, trends that I'm seeing. That way I can make quick changes to my average day, my average week, my average month. So ideally a 60, 70, 80-year-old Sam feels good about how things have gone.
Love that. That's actually one of those things I got away from. Now I might just have to bring it back in. Awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find there are certain things, without going, I promise I'll wrap this up in a second. Again, like you said, to spare our listeners, but I think for a lot of people, journaling, yoga, meditation, walks, unplugged time, going back to like expectation setting and feeling like a failure, those things I just mentioned, I think most of us get away from pretty often. And then we get back into them. We're like, oh man, like I feel good doing this. I need to remember that. I do want to remind people just what an uphill battle sometimes the very nature of our hyper responsive, very wound up world is, and kind of those obstacles that it presents to us. So yes, I think absolutely make every effort to get back to those things, but don't be super harsh on yourself when you get away from them. Again, I do think there are some external obstacles that we all have to deal with. So it's just coming back to center as often as you need to.
100%. Love that. And I love that that's like a good mic drop moment right there. That capped this off perfectly. And I know that we covered so much. And I know that this is going to be extremely valuable to people listening. And for everybody listening, if you found something that you really do resonate with and you have that friend or that family member that you're like, damn, they got to hear this, send it their way. Okay. Say, hey, at the 10-minute mark, you need to hear this, and just leave it at that. Leave them guessing. Now, when it comes to finding more about you, Sam, I know that people listening are going to be like, damn, I like Sam. I want to see more of his stuff. I want to see what he puts up.
Hopefully.
This contrarian guy that keeps circling back. But
yeah, the circle back guy, the analogy guy.
Where can they find more of your stuff if they are interested in seeing more?
I mean, Instagram, which is at Coach Sam Forget, which is spelled like forget. But my website, I would actually say, is the home base for all of my best free stuff. So that's my private newsletter, nutrition guides, articles from the last 10 years, season 1 of my own podcast. So yeah, that's kind of the home base for all the goods. So that's just samforget.com. So again, just SAMFORGET.com.
Awesome. And so everybody doesn't have to go searching. It's going to all be in the show notes. So just scroll down, give Sam a follow, check out his website, and then come back next time for the next episode of the Fit 40 podcast. Until then, everybody have a great rest of your week. Go kick some ass, and I'll see you next time.